Ladies, gentlemen, and exiles of all ages, over the weeks since the beginning of early access for Path of Exile 2, I've been bringing you with me on my Invoker journey, showing updates to what my setup is looking like at various points, and today with some inspiration from other Invokers, we've fiddled with things in a way that just makes map farming an absolute breeze, while still doing more than good enough single target damage too, especially compared to just how ridiculously tanky and sustainable it is too. Last time we talked about my setup, we were essentially using lightning skills and trying to build cold damage onto them to cause chain explosions upon killing enemies, and to put it simply, we've skipped a step in that process to make it way more effective. Now our main skill is simply Ice Strike for everything, rather than using Stormwave for clear and Tempest Flurry for single target, and trying to make those freeze enemies while they're doing lightning damage by default. We instead have Ice Strike now, which scales damage very comparably to Tempest Flurry, but is naturally a cold skill, which makes it much easier and more consistent to trigger Herald of Ice explosion chains across your whole screen, deleting every enemy on the screen, and even some off of the screen too, once you've got enough damage going with this. The idea for this swap up and the supports that I'm using to accomplish it are fully inspired by Don the Crown, who I want to give credit to for this. He's been pushing an Ice Strike focused build since launched, so go show him some love and check out his build if you're interested in it too, but I've been taking this in and essentially just melded it with our general build setup for something that I've been having an absolute blast playing for the last week or so, tweaking and adjusting it to find out what would work with my more budget standard of gear too. That said, a big thing that makes this sort of unique is that we also keep Charged Staff as a skill to give us a nice pile of flat lightning damage added to our attacks, as well as the projectile shockwaves to give us bonus range. But also, Charged Staff is essentially stronger the weaker that you are. The less damage you have from your weapon and bonuses on your equipment, the stronger that Charged Staff and its flat bonus is. So I always like to keep this in the build as it makes it more approachable on a budget, on top of the other benefits it has too. We're also running Combat Frenzy to generate frenzy charges, then using the Resonance Keystone to turn them into power charges to use with Charged Staff, and we are also running loads of Energy Shield as a main defensive focus, along with the Meditate Ascendancy skill, which you can use to overflow your Energy Shield up to double its normal maximum. We use this specifically for the start of maps, for moments where you want to quickly recharge loads of Energy Shield mid-combat, like during a Pinnacle boss perhaps, and we get the same effect almost passively when doing mass clearing content like mapping through Grim Feast. We then also have Unbound Avatar as well for frequent burst periods of higher damage and ailment application too, which especially helps our single target damage out. Then we have our Herald skills triggering each other through chains that can go off screen with just a hit or two to actually begin the chain itself, especially with the Poor Silk Kelm Ring, which can still make up for quite a lot of speed during mapping and enable some synergies to work without needing quite a stupidly strong weapon to get there. It makes it more approachable for a budget. That said, let's start by going over skill gems and persistent buff auras that we use, as well as the support gems inside of these too. Starting off with Meditate here, I've got Arcane Tempo as a support gem inside of this to increase the cast speed, as well as Ingenuity for 30% increased cooldown recovery on Meditate itself. This lets us use the skill more frequently, and for anyone who hasn't had to use the ability before, you do have to hold down Meditate's input to make the skill work. You can't just tap it or else it won't really do anything. Then we have Unbound Avatar, our other Ascendancy skill. We build up power for this by applying ailments to enemies, which is a main focus of the setup anyways, and this enables a 15-second buff period within this setup that increases elemental damage and ailment buildup by 40%. The supports that I have in here right now are Cold Mastery for a bonus level as it counts as a cold skill, Fire Mastery because it also counts as a fire skill, and then Persistence for 40% increased effect duration, as the only other place that we'd use that is Charged Staff, which feels fine without it, and this is quite a nice bonus to the actual duration of Unbound Avatar. After that, we've got Ice Strike as our main skill for pretty much everything, and this is essentially the cold damage counterpart to Tempest Flurry, being a 3-hit combo with an extra powerful third hit. This builds combo for Tempest Bell as well. It counts as an AoE attack, and it converts your physical damage into cold damage directly, which enables much easier synergy around cold damage too, as well as chill and freeze. As well, quality for this gem gives up to 10% bonus attack speed. For the support gems, I've got Martial Tempo for, again, faster attack speed, Concentrated Effect, which lowers the area of effect of the hits, but increases the damage by 40%, and then we've got Primal Armament for more weapon elemental damage, which is of course great as our focus is on the cold damage, which is elemental damage. Then we have Cold Infusion to give us a bonus 25% of damage with the skill as cold damage, at the cost of reducing other elemental damage types with the attack. And then Ice Bite, which gives an extra 35% of damage as cold damage for 3 seconds after you freeze an enemy with Ice Strike. The skill is the main way that we will start our freezing Herald explosion chain, so the effect will activate quite frequently. After this, we've got Tempest Bell, which is mostly our single target skill, and this is sort of back on the overabundant support gem train with this, letting us build combo for the bell while a bell is already active, which we then boost using our next skill gem setup 2 to do an incredible amount of burst damage. The other supports for the bell though are Heft, which increases the maximum physical damage that you can do using the bell, which is a physical damage skill as a base, and then we also have Heavy Swing for 35% more physical damage with the bell, and the attack speed lowering doesn't really affect the way the bell works. Then Font of Rage, which makes the bell give you rage buildup over time while you are standing near it, for bonus damage during your burst period as well. Then if you have the final support slot that I don't, if you have high crit chance but low crit damage, grab Super Critical, which increases your critical damage at the cost of some crit chance. If you have high critical damage but lower critical chance, use Leverage instead for bonus crit chance when freeze is applied to enemies being hit by Tempest Bell. Then for our main way of actually triggering Tempest Bell super quickly to proc all of the hits before the 3-second duration that it has with Overabundance, we have Elemental Invocation, which builds up energy when we freeze or shock enemies, which is then fed into Ball Lightning as the triggered skill. This builds up a bunch of casts to then trigger after setting up the Tempest Bell, especially as this gives us an extra method of applying shock relatively consistently, even outside of that. We then have the Impetus support gem for an extra 40% energy gained, Scattershot, which makes it fire out 3 Ball Lightnings per built up cast, and then Deceleration to make the Ball Lightning stay within range of Tempest Bell for their full duration to trigger as many shockwaves out of Tempest Bell as it possibly can. With the final support socket here, if I had that, I would use Energy Retention as a support for a 35% chance to refund half of the energy spent on each use too. When this procs, it would actually let you get even meatier burst damage out during your Tempest Spells and increase the single target a fair amount, especially during Unbound Avatar. After that, we have the Hand of Charyula skill, and what this does is apply curses and marks for us all together in one little neat bow that also basically just jumps on top of enemies. Specifically, we are using this to apply Freezing Mark, which makes it easier to freeze affected enemies, as well as Hypothermia, which reduces enemies' cold resistance. This is pretty much exclusively for the purpose of bossing, and it just makes them take more damage from our main source, which is cold damage. Then for a bonus support, I've got Heightened Curse in for 25% increased effect of the curse, and with another slot, I would use Chaos Mastery to increase the level of Hand of Charyula itself, which would reduce the reduction that it has on the slotted skill effects. After that, we've got Charged Staff, which we use to apply a general lightning weapon damage buff to all attacks, as well as adding a ranged shockwave to all of our attacks too. Inside of this, I've got Perpetual Charge as a support gem for a 35% chance to not remove charges when activating the buff. Cold Exposure, which reduces enemy cold resistance anytime that you get a crit with the shockwaves from this attack. Strip Away, which increases the effect of cold exposure applied by the skill, and Close Combat to boost the damage of extremely close range hits. Specifically, this is mostly for applying to single target scenarios where you are pressed up against an enemy spamming I Strike anyways. After that, we have Combat Frenzy, and this is our main way of generating power charges for Charged Staff. Inside of this, we have Profusion as a support for 50% chance for an additional charge gained on use, and if you have the Spare Spirit, you can always stick in Precision here too, like I have for bonus accuracy rating just permanently, though this is one that you can drop if you have less maximum spirit than I do to save 10 spirit right here. After that, then I have Wind Dancer. I have the number of skills that I do in this build due to using an unset ring. This gives me an extra skill gem slot compared to what I would have without that ring, and I have the spirit that I do from using a good body armor piece with the Ascendancy Node that converts body armor defenses to spirit for Invoker. If you are lacking either the extra skill slot from the ring or the 30 spirit cost of Wind Dancer if you have a worse body armor, this is the first thing that I would cut out to make up for that if you're using a lesser setup. It helps out defensively, don't get me wrong, both giving us increased evasion per stack while active and knocking back enemies after a melee attack hits us to help prevent us from getting beat up and killed on the spot. However, we mostly avoid that now through super high stun threshold anyways, and we are no longer a fully evasion focused setup, so the increased evasion helps a bit less too. That said, this is great if you have the space and the spirit for it as a bonus defensive layer to the build, but it's also the thing I'm most willing to lose if I did have less space. Inside of this then, I've got the Energy Barrier support to make energy shields start recharging immediately after being stunned while using this skill, Main to slow any enemies that are hit by the actual effect from the knockback itself, and then also Unbreakable, which gives 200% more stun threshold while the knockback effect itself is going off here. After that, we have Grim Feast, which makes enemies drop remnants that give you energy shield when you walk over them, and this can overflow up to double your maximum energy shield. This skill alone makes it easy to stay at double your maximum energy shield when just actively fighting your way through maps without any extra thought required. This makes you just way tankier as a result. Inside of this, I've got the Clarity support gem for increased mana regeneration rate, and for specifically bosses as well, I will often swap out Grim Feast into Ghost Dance instead, which gives us energy shield regen when we are hit, with the amount being scaled off of our evasion rating, which, while not overly high anymore, is still enough to fuel this skill reasonably well. When we swap to this for single target 2, we also use the fast forward support as well to increase the speed that the energy shield recharges from Ghost Dance itself. Then finally, we have our double Herald setup that is just destroying pretty much every mob mob clearing based endgame activity that exists. It just absolutely decimates anything that's like densely packed with mobs in mere moments. Firstly, we have Herald of Ice itself, which causes explosions when you shatter enemies while they're frozen, with the magnified effect support gem to increase the area of effect of the explosions, the innervate support gem for bonus damage as lightning damage after you kill shocked enemies with this skill, then conduction to increase the shock chance of Herald of Ice itself, lightning infusion to make Herald of Ice do bonus lightning damage but reduced cold damage, and then if you have the final slot as well, coursing current makes shocking hits from Herald of Ice also shock enemies that are nearby. The entire point of this is an attempt to make Herald of Ice itself shock enemies in order to proc the effect of Herald of Thunder. We then build Herald of Thunder to freeze our enemies so that the lightning bolts can shatter them and proc Herald of Ice, causing explosions through this, which then shocks them as well, giving us more procs of Herald of Thunder to freeze, and you get the idea. That's the infinite chain mob clear the moment you get your first shatter on an enemy within a group. The supports for Herald of Thunder then are Lightning Mastery for an extra level to this as it is a lightning skill, Glaciation for bonus freeze buildup from the skill's damage itself, Longshot for bonus damage from this when the enemies that it hits are more than 3.5 meters away from you up to its maximum bonus at 7 meters, and Ambush for double crit chance against full life enemies. This specifically allows the combo to deal enough damage, especially when it's chaining far away from you, that it will chain pop the enemies that are next to each other even in the distance. As for how to play while mapping, you just whack enemies with Ice Strike and it'll cause the heralds to do their thing. Get some power charges, apply charge staff, making it even easier to cause the chain reactions, and from further away too. For any rares that survive the initial burst of damage, or for bosses, throw down Tempest Bell after building up the combo, and then use Elemental Invocation while Ice Striking the Tempest Bell, which will apply freeze and shock to the bell to increase the damage it does, and firing out a load of ball lightnings from the Elemental Invocation to burst trigger the bell's hits itself. This will often cause enough shock so quickly as well in any content with multiple targets that it can refill its own energy as well. Use Unbound Avatar right before unleashing your Tempest Bell if you have it ready to initiate a burst period, and then just try to make the most out of that 15 seconds or so that you have. You can also use Unbound Avatar quite freely while mapping in general, as you build up energy very quickly while applying all of your different elemental effects to the enemies that you destroy. Other than that, use Hand of Charyula once every 7 seconds against bosses for the cold resistance reduction and freeze weakness application, and you're pretty much golden. Moving on then, let's talk about the Ascendancy passives that I'm taking for this setup. The first two earlier on in the process were Sunder My Enemies. This lets you just ignore non-negative elemental resistances when you critically hit, but now we're working through cold resistance through supports and stuff like that, such rather than using Ascendancy Nodes to accomplish it, which gives us a bit more control and more consistent return from our Ascendancy points. We then use Lead Me Through Grace, which makes your body armor, energy shield, and evasion rating give you bonus spirit at the cost of making equipment spirit bonuses not work for you anymore. To use my exact setup, you need 230 spirit, which means 130 bonus spirit from this node. Achieving that would take a body armor that has 960 evasion and 390 energy shield for a hybrid piece, which is what I recommend getting for this. However, the optional setups that I talked about in the skill gem setup can apply to those who have 220 spirit or 190 spirit if you're someone who has less than I do. Then we take Meditate over here for a controllable mass energy shield recharging skill. This mostly is used at the start of a fresh map to give us overflow, or in moments of peace during longer boss encounters like pinnacle bosses. Then for the final 4 points, we put them into I Am the Blizzard over here, which gives you 10% of damage as extra cold damage and creates freezing ground when you freeze enemies, leading through over to Anti-Shell Rage for Unbound Avatar as a skill too. If you eventually get your defensive gear to the point where Meditate feels a bit superfluous, or if you're only doing mapping and avoiding bosses so you've got Grim Feast running anyways, or if you're doing just stuff that's easy compared to the gear that you have so it doesn't feel like you have any chance of dying, you can instead switch out the Meditate points to go and do some bonus elemental damage, and then I Am the Thunder, which gives you extra damage as lightning too, and chance to create shocked ground when shocking enemies. This does lower the damage requirements as well to cause the doubled Herald explosion chains if you're struggling to hit that breakpoint, so you can do this to actually make the chain explosions happen easier at the cost of some of the defense and survivability options offered by Meditate. Then moving on to our passive tree at large, we're going to start by heading up the right side here for some bonus evasion rating and energy shield, over into Step Like Mist for some bonus movement speed, which is fantastic, as well as bonus mana regen, dex, and intelligence. We grab Essence of the Mountain for extra damage as cold damage and some extra freeze buildup. We go around through the notable for evasion and bonus maximum energy shield into Flow Like Water for bonus attack speed as well as dexterity and intelligence. We then go up through Crashing Wave for increased damage if you've dealt a critical hit in the past 8 seconds, and we also get some bonus crit chance from the nodes beside it. After that, we hit our sort of attribute highway here. For the most part, you want to focus on dexterity above intelligence for your attribute nodes, though you want a healthy amount of intelligence too. You need 30 strength somewhere within your setup as well to use our specific support gems too. We then head up here through to the elemental damage cluster here, over to Echoing Frost, which gives you bonus elemental damage if you've recently chilled an enemy, as well as Echoing Thunder, which is the exact same thing, but if you've recently shocked an enemy. We both chill and shock extremely frequently, and so we get both of these effects, which is just a pile of bonus elemental damage, which applies to both our lightning and cold damage that we do respectively. As well, I don't currently have flat fire damage on my gear, but if you do have flat fire damage somewhere on your gear, across your rings, your gloves, or even on your weapon, you can also take Echoing Flames, which is another pile of bonus elemental damage if you've recently ignited an enemy. So that's also an option if you have that, but never take that if you don't have fire damage, obviously. Then we go even further over here to grab a bunch of energy shield increasing nodes, and these also give us increased mana regen rate, as well as a % increase to our intelligence too. We then take a few nodes even further towards the intelligence starting point, grabbing dampening shield for increased maximum energy shield by a pretty hefty amount, as well as 12% of maximum energy shield as additional stun threshold. We also aim for a little bit of that stat from our jewels as well, and that's what makes our stun threshold so high, as we hit pretty high actual energy shield itself, which then translates into very high stun threshold, which means it's very hard for us to get stunned in melee range too. We also pick up pure energy, which is just a nice big increase to maximum energy shield, as well as a bit of flat intelligence too. Then we head up more at the right side of the sort of attribute sort of line here, and grab up over into Killer Instinct for 3 nodes. This gives us bonus attack damage from both of the smaller nodes, and then also 30% increased attack damage when on full life, which we will pretty much always be due to our high evasion and our massive pool of energy shield, especially when we grab Chaos Inoculation at the very end of our sort of passive tree journey. Then we're going to be taking a branch off over here to go into Resonance as a keystone passive, and this is what converts the frenzy charges that we get from Combat Frenzy into power charges for Charged Staff. We then go up and over into our first jewel slot over here. Generally for your jewels, you want to focus on maximum energy shield bonuses, cold damage bonuses, freeze or general ailment buildup. Maximum energy shield as stun threshold is like also great again, or if you get damage with quarterstaves or attack speed on emeralds as well. Time lost jewels also have a lot of potential value if you get a good one. I love this specific slot for them right here on the skill tree, because you just take a ton of small passives and a few notables in the radius here. This one gives me 2% spell damage, which only affects ball landing for us, but then also 3% maximum energy shield per small passive in the radius, and in our current setup this gives us 18% spell damage and 27% increased maximum energy shield. We then also get 6% increased freeze buildup and 3% increased general ailment chance per notable. We take 3 notables in the radius, so 18% bonus freeze buildup and 9% all ailment chance increase. A lot of the footage is done with just a regular Sapphire with some cold damage boost is the main thing that's on it, not even with this, so don't even think that this is a requirement to hit the power that we have, but I just recently picked this up and I wanted to show where I would put into a skill tree if you did get a nice time lost jewel and why. We then grab a bunch of nodes within this crit chance and crit damage cluster over here, which gives us just a lot of damage for just a few nodes and very little travel in between. This also gives you increased damage if you've dealt a critical hit recently, which we will be doing a lot, so this is a good general bonus. After that we head up a little bit further to get some bonus attack speed, and then some bonus attack speed with also reduced cost of skills, which is quite nice in itself. We then grab some bonus maximum energy shield as well as some evasion rating, and then also a little bit of bonus of a 25% reduced effect of curses against you, which isn't why we take the node, but it is nice whenever you get any of the waystones that do actually apply curses to the player too. We then start heading out towards the edge, taking one last stop for Spectral Ward through some other energy shield and evasion rating increasing nodes. This gives us +1 maximum energy shield per 12 evasion rating that you have on your equipped body armor. On my personal equipped body armor, I've got 1062 evasion, so this gives me an extra 89 energy shield, which applies underneath all of the different energy shield increases elsewhere within our setup. So it's quite a useful amount gained from this single passive. We then head out to the actual edge through another jewel socket, which is quite nice of course, and we wrap down along the side to the quarterstaff cluster of nodes. Here we pick up this sort of middle selection. We go for increased attack speed with quarterstaffs, which is great. We also get increased critical damage with quarterstaffs, we get increased accuracy rating with quarterstaffs, increased dexterity, and then some increased crit chance with quarterstaffs as well. These affect pretty much all of our attacks, so that is quite good. We then go through another jewel socket, which is great as well, down to the sort of Herald cluster here. We get increased damage while affected by a Herald, which is great in general, but also Coming Calamity. This gives us 50% increased cold damage and 50% increased lightning damage because we always have Herald of Ice and Herald of Thunder active while we're in this playstyle. Then we wrap around for these crit nodes down here, grabbing a bunch of extra crit damage, a bit of extra crit chance as well, and importantly some extra base crit chance, weapon crit chance essentially, which means it applies under every single other increased crit chance node that you can have through your passives or even through increased crit chance on your gear too. We then wrap up over into enhanced reflexes for extra evasion rating and also % increased dexterity through some very hefty dexterity increasing nodes and over through the attack speed to get to Falcon Technique itself over here. This gives you 1% increased attack speed per 15 dexterity, which adds up to being quite a bit of bonus attack speed if you are stacking your stats a reasonable amount, which you do have to in the first place to actually level your skills properly and to use a really good quarterstaff too. Then we wrap down to the jewel socket here itself for an extra jewel socket of goodness, and into this cluster here, which gives us bonus melee damage, a bunch of extra melee attack speed, as well as +2 to melee strike range, which just increases our effective range with our main abilities. At this point, I'm level 92, so that's all of those skill points spent. I have 8 more to spend before I'll hit 100. The next few that I would spend would be the 4 out here to get outside of Chaos Inoculation. Then the 5th point would be to Chaos Inoculation itself. This would set our maximum life to 1, of course, which is a bit low, but it would make you immune to chaos damage. And yes, maximum life becoming 1 isn't ideal, but being immune to chaos damage makes our maximum energy shield stacking a very, very much even more potent defensive layer. Then we take 1 point over here for our 6th point, just to actually unlock 1 more jewel socket for all the goodness that'll give us, and then you have 2 points left within my setup, which if you have the time lost jewel like I do in here, I would put these 2 into some extra crit chance and crit damage, both for the fact that those are good within themselves, but also the fact that it gives you bonus effects from the time lost jewel that you've got in too. Then I should also mention, if you do want to have a slightly less offensive setup and slightly more defensive at the sort of end of this track, you could drop off the melee strike range nodes as well as the melee attack speed and melee damage nodes here to instead take 6 points over up this way into 1, 2, 3, then 15% increased maximum energy shield, 60% increased maximum energy shield at the cost of 20% slower start of recharge, which doesn't really matter because we do most of our energy shield recharging through actually meditating or through Grim Feast, and then the final point into Ingenuity for plus 25 to your intelligence stat, allowing you to move some other stats around in other parts of the setup too. Then finally, let's talk about my gear and any ways that I might change it in the future. Starting off with the weapon then, you want just massive amounts of physical damage as your top priority. The best bases for weapons are Expert Slicing for more damage or Expert Barrier for some block chance, and the ideal modifiers are flat physical damage increase and percent increased physical damage above all other prefixes, with good tertiary ones being percent increased elemental attack damage, flat cold damage, flat lightning damage, or even flat fire damage is decent too because it can let you take Echoing Flames as a passive as well. For suffixes, you want critical hit chance, critical hit damage, and attack speed. Extra levels to melee skills is an acceptable choice instead, but it does increase the difficulty of sustaining your mana within the build, and it doesn't affect all of our skills either, as the heralds, which are our main map clear setup, do not count as melee skills. For rings, a bit of a contradictory sounding statement to begin with is that the Porcer Kelm unique ring costs around 10 exalted or even less for a relatively okay roll. You don't need a great roll for this though, because it's the main effect that matters, as it can increase your clear speed significantly on a lower budget. This ring is the quickest band-aid for map clearing within the build if your weapon has less DPS than you'd like it to, as it simply makes enemies shatter when chilled as if they were frozen. This speeds up the chain interactions between your skills to make up for the difference in damage. However, this has no impact on single target, it doesn't help single target at all, so I recommend dropping this ring for single target no matter what. And once you have enough damage to cause chain reactions without this ring, you're actually better off not using it at all, but it is a great stopgap along the way. That said, outside of that, I use one unset ring to have the bonus skill slot that I do for this setup, and your ideal modifiers are flat cold damage, percent increased cold damage, and resistances on your rings. Mana regeneration is nice, rarity of items found is of course great, anywhere you can put it on your gear if you do have the extra currency to spring for it is fantastic, or alternatively, flat lightning damage or flat fire damage would be nice offensively as well. For your other ring, you want to focus just heavily on resistances once again, and also ideally long term this would be a breach ring that has cold flat damage, cold percent damage increase, and cold resistance, all boosted by cold quality increase. For the amulet, you want boost to maximum energy shield, any attributes that you need. Resistances are easy to grab here too, and if you can afford it, squeezing increased critical hit chance here is quite valuable offensively. For your anointment, Storm Charged is sort of the ideal one in a perfect world, as this gives you both increased crit chance and a bunch of increased elemental damage if you've dealt a critical hit recently. A budget alternative that is both cheaper than this as far as the actual emotions it costs to create, and actually works better for budget setups as it enables the chaining effects to happen on your skills with much less actual damage required to hit them, is Tainted Strike. This gives you increased critical hit chance for all attacks and also increased magnitude of non-damaging ailments to inflict with critical hits. This includes Shock, increasing the magnitude of shock, which basically counts as increasing the damage of everything else that you do. It also increases the magnitude of Chill and Freeze, which is lovely too for its own reasons. For your gloves, I use a hybrid base for evasion rating and energy shield, which ideally would have bonus to energy shield as modifiers, bonus flat cold damage, and then mostly just resistances. That said, if you have a Hand of Wisdom in action, unique, it fits very naturally into this build if you can get the resistances without using your gloves for them. Mostly just for the bonus attack speed, scaling up your dexterity, which is great, and even more importantly, the massive pile of flat lightning damage to attacks, which scales off of intelligence. If you have these gloves, you want to use them in this build, and if you have them in this build, you want to swap to favoring intelligence from your attributes above favoring dexterity, pass your skill and gear requirements to scale this flat damage increase, because it is a very hefty amount, especially as it actually will apply to Herald of Ice and boost its shock application ability, which then makes the chain explosions even stronger and more reliable. For my body armor then, the main focus above all else was hitting evasion and energy shield that could give me the spirit that I wanted through the Ascendancy Node. Then past that, you want to focus mostly just on resistances. For the helmet, I've got a pure energy shield base to try and sort of pop up my overall energy shield number using this slot, so I've got energy shield increasing modifiers, and then ideally it would have a good chunk of resistances as well, and increased critical hit chance if you can fit it on there would be lovely too. Then for your boots, your main priority above all else all the time is movement speed. The more of it you can get, the better. I've got pure energy shield base boots. Again, movement speed was the main reason that I got these in the first place, but bonus energy shield modifiers would be great, as would a pile of resistances to help you reach your maximums. Then finally for your belt, the best stuff we can really use the belt slot for is mana management and resistances, though if you either get lucky from the King and the Mist Pinnacle boss or have a pile of divine orbs to buy one with, the best in slot belt by far is Ingenuity, which increases the effect of your equipped rings, and with good enough rings, the value of that belt is absolutely immense. That just about does it for today, everyone. My full setup as it currently stands in Path of Exile 2, mixing the basis of the build that I've been working on since launch with some major inspiration from Don the Crown's Ice Strike setup, and this thing is just ripping through every activity I put it to task with, and it's made Breach especially just feel like an absolute dopamine rush to interact with, even on my imperfect gear setup, with the main limiting factor within Breach for me now being literal raw movement speed, even up to tier 18 equivalent maps. I hope you've all enjoyed this then, and hopefully you enjoy using this build for yourself too if you try out this full setup. Like if you liked the video, subscribe with the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.